It was a quiet evening in a small American town. The streets were not too busy and the sun had just gone down, leaving behind a warm orange glow in the sky. Most people were heading home after work, some stopping by diners or small shops before calling it a night. Into this calm scene drove a man whose life was anything but ordinary. He was not just any man. He was a highly respected U.S. Army general, a man who had served his country for decades, carrying medals of honor and stories of bravery that most people could only imagine. That evening, the general had just left a military ceremony. He was still in his full uniform. The polished badges on his chest reflected the soft light from the street lamps, and the shining stars on his shoulders marked his high rank. His car was simple, not flashy, but inside it sat a man who had given his life to serve his country. He was calm, driving steadily, thinking about the words he had spoken earlier at the ceremony. He had addressed young soldiers, reminding them about discipline, respect, and the duty of protecting the nation. As he drove through the quiet town, the general noticed a police car parked on the side of the road. He thought nothing of it, for he was not speeding nor was he breaking any traffic law. But within moments, flashing red and blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror. The siren blared, breaking the silence of the street. The general gently pulled his car over, wondering what the matter could be. The police officer stepped out of the patrol car. From his expression, it was clear he had already judged the situation before even walking up to the general's car. His stride was sharp and his eyes carried suspicion instead of professionalism. He tapped on the window and the general calmly rolled it down. "License and registration," the officer said in a sharp tone, not even glancing at the uniform the general wore. The general nodded politely, handed over his documents, and spoke in a calm voice. "Officer, may I ask what the issue is? I believe I was driving within the speed limit." But the officer was not listening. His eyes flicked over the uniform, then narrowed. "Why are you wearing that?" he asked, his voice carrying doubt. "This is my uniform," the general replied, keeping his tone respectful. "I am returning from a military ceremony." The officer smirked as if he did not believe him. "You expect me to believe that? People don't just walk around dressed like that. You think you can fool me?" The general could feel the tension building, but he stayed calm. Years of military training had taught him that patience and composure often won more battles than anger. He reached into his wallet and pulled out his official military ID. He handed it to the officer. "This is my identification," he said. "It clearly shows my rank and name. Please take a look." The officer barely glanced at it. Instead of reading, he waved it away. "This looks fake," he muttered. "I've seen plenty of people trying to play soldier. You're not going to trick me." By now, a few passers-by had noticed what was happening. People walking their dogs slowed down, and others standing near a small shop looked over curiously. A decorated general in uniform being questioned so rudely by an officer, it was a scene they had not expected to see. The general, however, did not argue. He knew that raising his voice or showing frustration would only make the situation worse. "Officer," he said softly, "I assure you I am who I say I am. If you wish, you may call the local base to confirm." But the officer was not interested in confirming anything. His pride and prejudice clouded his judgment. He stepped back, hand resting on his belt, and said loudly, "Step out of the vehicle." The general took a slow breath, then opened the car door. His tall frame stepped out, his uniform neat and his posture upright. Even without speaking, his presence carried authority and dignity. Still, the officer acted as though he was dealing with a criminal. "Put your hands where I can see them," the officer barked. The general obeyed without resistance. His calmness surprised some of the bystanders. They expected a man of such rank to protest, but instead he stood silently, showing discipline even in the face of disrespect. One young man in the crowd whispered to another, "That guy looks serious. Look at all those medals on his chest. He must be real military." But the officer ignored the murmurs. He pulled out handcuffs and began to place them on the general's wrists. Gasps came from the small crowd. The sight was shocking. A decorated U.S. Army general being handcuffed like a criminal in front of everyone. "Officer," the general said gently, "I am not resisting, but you are making a mistake." The officer tightened the cuffs. "We'll see about that at the station," he said smugly. "You're not fooling anyone here." Inside, the general felt a mixture of sadness and disbelief. All his life he had fought for respect, for his country, for the men and women under his command, and for the values of fairness. Yet here he was, standing on a small town street, treated as if he were nothing. The bystanders began to record the scene on their phones. In the modern world, nothing stayed hidden. Some shook their heads, whispering, "This isn't right. That man is clearly an officer. Why won't the cop even check properly?" The general, however, did not let anger cloud his mind. He reminded himself of the discipline he had always taught younger soldiers. In the face of provocation, remain calm. In the face of disrespect, stand tall. And in the face of injustice, trust that truth will reveal itself. As he was led toward the patrol car, he looked up at the night sky, his mind calm but focused. He knew something the officer did not. Power did not always come from loud voices or flashing lights. Sometimes true power lay in patience, in silence, and in knowing when to act. That night was far from over. The general already knew that one phone call at the right time would change everything. But for now, he allowed the officer to continue, his calmness becoming a quiet strength in the middle of an unfair arrest. And so, the stage was set. A small town street, a misguided officer, and a man of honor whose dignity could not be broken. What happened next would not only surprise everyone present, but also remind the world that respect cannot be forced. It must be earned. The police officer held the general firmly by the arm as he led him to the patrol car. The shining medals on the general's chest still glimmered under the streetlights, but they meant nothing to the officer who refused to see the truth. The handcuffs were tight, and yet the general did not protest. He had carried heavier burdens in his life, both on the battlefield and in the halls of leadership. A pair of cuffs could not shake his calmness. As he was guided into the back seat of the patrol car, the general kept his eyes steady. He looked out the window as curious bystanders whispered and filmed the shocking event. The small crowd had grown. Some were muttering that this was unfair, while others stood frozen, unsure if they should intervene. A few shook their heads in disbelief, whispering, "That man is not just anyone. Look at his uniform. He's a general." The officer, however, refused to listen to reason. His chest puffed with authority as he climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. He spoke loudly, almost as if trying to show off his power in front of the onlookers. "Pretending won't save you. You'll learn your lesson once we reach the station." The general remained silent. He had learned long ago that silence in the right moment was more powerful than any argument. He let the officer talk, let him feel in control, because deep inside, the general knew the truth always had a way of coming out. The patrol car pulled away from the street, leaving behind a trail of murmurs, camera flashes, and stunned expressions. Inside the car, the air was heavy with tension. The officer glanced back in the mirror, his eyes filled with suspicion and arrogance. "What were you doing driving through here dressed like that?" the officer demanded. "I was returning from a military ceremony," the general said quietly. "I have served this nation for decades. My documents are real," the officer chuckled, shaking his head. "You really don't know when to stop pretending. People like you think they can fool anyone, but not me." The general looked out of the window again, watching the quiet neighborhoods pass by. Children were playing outside some houses. Families were gathering on porches, and streetlights glowed warmly. He thought of how many times he had fought for the safety of these very families, never asking for recognition, never expecting anything in return. It felt strange to be treated as a fraud in the same country he had dedicated his life to protecting. The drive to the station was not long, but for the officer, it was an opportunity to display his power. He spoke in a mocking tone, asking questions without waiting for answers, criticizing the uniform and doubting every word. Yet the general remained patient. His posture was straight, his expression calm. Even in the back of a police car, he carried himself with dignity. When they arrived at the station, the officer led him inside. The front desk sergeant raised his eyebrows in surprise when he saw the man in handcuffs. He noticed the uniform immediately and hesitated. "Who is this?" he asked, clearly confused. "Another imposter," the arresting officer said quickly. "Caught him pretending to be military. He had some fake ID on him." The sergeant glanced again at the uniform, noticing the medals and stars. His eyes shifted uneasily, but he said nothing. He had worked long enough to know that sometimes arguing with a fellow officer only created more tension. So he simply nodded and began writing in the logbook. The general was guided toward the booking area. He was asked to sit down on a hard bench near the wall. His cuffs were still tight around his wrists, but he did not complain. Instead, he quietly observed the room, the buzzing fluorescent lights, the hum of the computers, the smell of stale coffee, and the hurried footsteps of officers moving around. The arresting officer leaned against the counter, speaking loudly to others in the room. He thought he could fool me, dressed up like a general carrying fake documents, but I saw through it. Some officers looked uncertain. They glanced at the man on the bench, noticing how calmly he sat, noticing how real the uniform looked. A few whispered to each other, their voices low. "Are you sure? That looks legitimate. Why would anyone risk impersonating at this level?" But the arresting officer refused to hear doubt. His pride made him blind to reason. He continued filling out paperwork, determined to prove himself right. The general, meanwhile, closed his eyes for a moment and thought about the irony of the situation. He had walked through deserts, jungles, and war zones, had been saluted by soldiers from around the world, and had represented his country in meetings with presidents and foreign leaders. And now he was sitting quietly on a wooden bench in a small-town police station, treated as if he were a common criminal. Yet he did not feel anger. Instead, he felt clarity. He knew that life sometimes tested patience in unexpected ways. This was one of those moments. He reminded himself that discipline was not only for the battlefield, it was also for times like these. Across the room, one young officer kept staring at the general's medals. He finally whispered to another, "I studied military history in college. Those medals aren't easy to get. They look real. Do you think?" His voice trailed off as he noticed the arresting officer glaring at him, warning him not to question the situation. Time passed slowly in the station. The officer continued to process paperwork, taking his time as if enjoying the moment. The general waited patiently, his mind calm but his thoughts clear. He knew this charade would not last forever. There was a moment coming when the truth would have to be revealed. Finally, the officer walked over and said, "You'll be allowed one phone call soon, but don't think it's going to save you. Whoever you're calling won't be able to stop what's coming." The general lifted his eyes and looked directly at the officer. His voice was firm yet calm. "One call is all I will need." The officer smirked, thinking the words were empty. He did not realize that the man sitting before him had access to the highest offices in the nation. He did not know that the general's voice alone could open doors that no amount of arrogance could shut. As the general sat waiting, the weight of the situation pressed on the room. Some officers avoided eye contact, unsure of what to believe. A few were beginning to sense that something was not right, and yet the arresting officer, blinded by his prejudice, continued forward, unaware that the ground beneath him was about to shift. The general leaned back slightly on the bench, breathing deeply. He had been in tougher situations. He had faced real enemies on the battlefield. This was not a fight of weapons or strength. This was a fight of patience, truth, and timing. He knew that the moment was coming when he would be given that one chance to act. And when it came, everything would change, not just for him but for everyone in the room. The general sat quietly on the bench in the holding area, his wrists still bound by the cold steel of the handcuffs. Around him, the police station buzzed with the usual activity, phones ringing, officers typing reports, and radios crackling with updates from patrol cars. Yet in that noisy room, the calmness of the general seemed to stand out. He was not restless, not nervous, not broken. He was waiting. The arresting officer finished his paperwork and walked over with a smug look. "All right," he said, "you get your one call. Not that it's going to do you any good. Whoever you call can't get you out of this." The general did not argue. He only nodded, as if the officer had just confirmed something he already knew. He stood up tall, even with the cuffs on, and walked steadily toward the small desk where the phone was placed. Several officers watched, curiosity building in their eyes. Something about this man did not feel ordinary. His discipline, his patience, his steady presence, it all seemed to carry a weight they could not explain. The officer unlocked one of his wrists and allowed him to hold the phone. "Make it quick," the officer said, crossing his arms. The general picked up the receiver. His fingers dialed a number with precision, not hesitating for even a second. It was clear this was not the first time he had made this call. The line rang once, and then a firm voice answered, "Pentagon Operations, who is speaking?" The general's voice was calm but carried authority. This is General Softhumb. I've been detained in a local police station under false pretenses. Connect me to the duty officer immediately. The room grew quiet. The young officer sitting at the nearby desk blinked in surprise. The word Pentagon hung in the air like a thunderclap. The arresting officer, however, rolled his eyes. Nice try, he muttered, loud enough for others to hear. You really think we're going to believe that? But then something happened that none of them expected. The voice on the other end of the line suddenly grew sharper. General, sir, please stay on the line. I will connect you immediately. Are you safe at this moment? Yes, the general replied calmly. I am safe. But this needs to be addressed quickly. The officer closest to the general almost dropped the pen in his hand. He leaned slightly forward, trying to hear more. The tone of respect from the Pentagon officer was unmistakable. Within moments, another voice came on the line. It was even firmer, even more commanding. General, this is Major Richards at the Pentagon. We've been alerted of your call. Tell me your location. The general gave the name of the small-town police station. I was arrested without cause. My credentials were dismissed. I am currently in custody. The duty officer did not hesitate. Understood, sir. We will take immediate action. Please hold the line. At that very moment, the Pentagon came alive. Messages were sent, calls were made, and high-ranking officials were alerted. The idea that a decorated U.S. Army general had been arrested unlawfully sparked immediate urgency. Within minutes, the Department of Defense was in contact with state authorities. The local governor's office was informed. The chain of command moved like a well-oiled machine, each person understanding the seriousness of the situation. Back in the small station, the arresting officer smirked, trying to mask his growing unease. What, did they believe you? You really had them fooled with your act? But others in the room were no longer so sure. They had heard the respectful tone on the other end of the line. They had seen the general's steady eyes as he spoke. This was not a man pretending. This was someone used to commanding respect at the highest level. The general calmly handed the phone back once his call was complete. Thank you, he said, his voice carrying a quiet certainty. He returned to the bench and sat down again as though nothing unusual had happened. But inside the station, the atmosphere had shifted. Officers whispered to one another. Some checked their phones, already seeing early notifications and chatter spreading about what was happening. One young officer muttered, "If that really was the Pentagon, then we're in big trouble." The arresting officer tried to maintain control. He spoke louder, giving orders to others to process the general's case. Yet his voice no longer carried the same confidence. Doubt had started to creep in. Minutes later, the phone at the front desk rang sharply. The sergeant picked it up and his expression instantly changed. He stiffened, his voice respectful. Yes, sir. Yes, sir, he is here. Understood. When he hung up, his face was pale. He turned to the arresting officer. That was the state chief's office. They've been contacted by the Pentagon. They want to know immediately why this man is being held. The room froze. Every officer stared at the general, who sat calmly on the bench waiting. The arresting officer's face turned red. He stammered, That can't be true. But before he could say more, the phones rang again. This time the call came from the governor's office. The sergeant answered, his hands trembling slightly, then nodded quickly. Yes, sir, we will release him immediately. Yes, sir, I understand. When he hung up, his eyes locked on the arresting officer. They're sending representatives down here now. Release him at once. The arresting officer's pride began to crumble. His voice was unsteady, but he tried one last time. It's a mistake. He's not who he says he is. It can't be. But even as he spoke, the general's phone call continued to ripple outward. In Washington, senior officials were preparing statements. In the state capitol, leaders were demanding explanations. What had started as a simple phone call was now an unfolding storm. The general finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. I told you. One call was all it would take. The officer fell silent. Around the room, every other pair of eyes now looked at the general with respect, even awe. The truth was no longer hidden, it was arriving like a wave. The general sat quietly on the wooden bench, his eyes calm, his posture steady. The police station buzzed with tension, but he seemed untouched by it. Around him, whispers had started to grow. Officers who had once looked at him with suspicion were now exchanging nervous glances. They had all heard the phone calls, seen the urgency in the sergeant's voice, and noticed how quickly the atmosphere had changed after the Pentagon became involved. Minutes felt like hours. Every ring of the station's phone seemed louder than before. Every step echoing through the halls felt heavier. Something big was coming and everyone knew it. Then the silence was broken by the sound of vehicles outside. Engines roared as several black SUVs pulled up in front of the station. Their headlights cut through the night, and the sound of doors slamming shut sent a shiver through the building. Officers inside rushed to the windows, peeking out nervously. The arresting officer's face drained of color. The front doors of the station opened sharply, and in walked a group of state officials, escorted by stern-looking men in suits. Their pace was fast, their expressions serious. One of them flashed credentials that immediately silenced the room. Another officer whispered under his breath, "Federal agents." Behind them came the chief of police, who had been urgently called from his home. His shirt was only half tucked in, his face pale and his eyes wide with worry. He rushed forward, looking at the man sitting calmly on the bench. "His worst fears were confirmed, General," the chief stammered, his voice shaking. "Please forgive this terrible mistake." The arresting officer stood frozen, unable to move. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The realization of what he had done was finally sinking in. He hadn't just arrested a man, he had arrested a U.S. Army general, someone directly connected to the Pentagon. The general rose slowly from the bench. Even with handcuffs still on his wrists, his presence filled the room with dignity and quiet strength. He did not shout, he did not show anger. He simply looked at the chief, then at the others who had entered with authority that outshone everyone else in the room. One of the federal officials spoke firmly. "Remove the handcuffs immediately." The officer standing nearby scrambled to obey, fumbling with the keys before finally unlocking the cuffs. The sound of the metal falling open echoed in the tense room. The general rubbed his wrist gently but said nothing. As he stood tall, the federal officials gave him a respectful nod. One of them even straightened slightly as if standing at attention. The room felt heavier now, not because of noise but because of silence. Everyone knew they were in the presence of someone far greater than they had first imagined. The crowd that had gathered outside the station pressed closer to the doors, trying to get a glimpse of what was happening. Many had followed from the street where the arrest had taken place, still recording videos and whispering about the shocking scene. When they saw the general being released, a wave of murmurs swept through them. The chief of police turned on his officer. His voice, which had trembled moments before, now carried sharpness. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" The arresting officer stuttered. I thought he was pretending. I didn't believe the ID. I thought." "You thought wrong," the chief snapped, cutting him off. His voice was filled with controlled anger. "You arrested a decorated general of the United States Army. You disrespected his rank, his service, and his identity. And now the entire Pentagon is watching this station because of your actions." The officer's lips trembled. His arrogance had disappeared, replaced with the crushing weight of regret. He looked down, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The general, however, did not gloat. He did not look at the officer with revenge. Instead, he turned back to the chief, his voice calm but powerful. "I have no interest in anger. I only wanted respect, not for myself but for the uniform I wear. It represents the thousands of men and women who serve this country every day. When that uniform is dismissed, when that service is doubted without reason, it dishonors more than just one man." The chief swallowed hard, nodding quickly. "You are absolutely right, General. This will not be ignored. There will be consequences." Outside, the crowd was buzzing louder now. People were talking about what they had just witnessed. A proud officer humbled, a general released with honor, and federal officials arriving within minutes of one phone call. News was already spreading through social media, fueled by the videos recorded earlier. Inside the station, the federal officials began speaking quietly with the general, offering assistance, apologizing for the incident, and assuring him that steps were being taken at the highest levels. The general listened, his face composed. He accepted their respect but did not ask for special treatment. For him, dignity was not about shouting or punishing. It was about standing firm in the truth. The arresting officer stood off to the side, sweating under the weight of the moment. His career, his reputation, everything he thought he controlled was now slipping away. The chief turned to him again, his voice low but sharp. "You'll answer for this. For now, step outside." The officer nodded weakly and walked out, his shoulders slumped. The same crowd that had watched him earlier now looked at him with judgment. whispering about the arrogance they had seen. Back inside, the general finally spoke again. "I do not hold grudges. I only hope this becomes a lesson, that respect cannot be based on appearances or assumptions. Respect must be given to all people regardless of who they are until the truth proves otherwise." His words carried weight. Even those who had not directly been involved felt the impact. Officers stood straighter, humbled by the quiet power of the man before them. As the general stepped out of the station, escorted by officials, the crowd erupted with cheers and clapping. Phones recorded the moment as he walked with dignity, his uniform shining under the streetlights once again, this time not in handcuffs, but in honor. The SUVs waited outside to escort him safely, but before entering, he paused for a moment, looking at the people gathered. He did not wave dramatically or give a speech. He simply nodded, a small gesture that carried a deep message. Patience, dignity, and truth always find their way to light. The arresting officer, standing further back, watched silently. His arrogance had been replaced with shame. He now understood that he had not just misjudged a man, he had misjudged history, honor, and service. Inside the station, phones continued to ring and urgent messages kept arriving. But outside, the night air carried a different energy. The story was no longer about a wrongful arrest. It had become a story of discipline, calmness, and the quiet strength of a man who knew that real power does not come from shouting, but from truth. And as the general's car door closed, and the convoy prepared to leave, everyone who had witnessed the scene knew one thing for certain: nothing about this night would ever be forgotten. The convoy of black SUVs moved steadily through the quiet streets, their headlights slicing through the night. Inside one of the vehicles sat the general, his uniform still flawless despite the long hours, his medals catching the glow of the passing lights. He was silent, gazing out the window, reflecting on what had just taken place. In his long career, he had faced countless challenges, on battlefields, in war rooms, and during delicate negotiations. But that evening's incident in a small-town police station was different. It was not a battle of weapons or strategies. It was a battle of dignity, patience, and truth had won. By the time the general reached his quarters, the story had already begun spreading across the nation. Videos taken by bystanders were flooding social media. Headlines flashed across news sites. Decorated Army general wrongfully arrested in small town. The public was shocked, but also inspired. People saw the calm strength the general displayed, even in humiliation, and many admired how he chose patience over anger. The next morning, the incident was the top story on national television. Commentators debated how such a mistake could have happened. Officials released statements and citizens expressed both outrage and respect. The Pentagon confirmed that the general had been unlawfully detained, and they praised his restraint and discipline during the event. Meanwhile, at the small-town police station, the atmosphere was heavy. The arresting officer sat in a separate office facing suspension and investigation. His arrogance from the night before was gone. Now he understood the weight of his actions, not just against one man, but against the dignity of an entire institution. The chief of police issued a public apology, admitting the mistake and promising reforms in training, awareness, and respect. But the general did not spend his time focusing on punishment. Instead, he returned to his duties. The very next day, he was back in meetings, addressing soldiers, planning strategies, and continuing the work he had always done. When asked by reporters for a comment, his response was measured and powerful. "I did not feel anger. I felt disappointment. Respect must never be denied to anyone, whether they wear a uniform or not. My only hope is that this moment reminds us all to look beyond assumptions, to treat others with dignity, and to remember that true strength lies in patience." Those words spread quickly, quoted in newspapers and repeated on news broadcasts. For many, they carried a lesson larger than the incident itself. Communities across the country discussed the event. Teachers shared it in classrooms as an example of discipline and leadership. Veterans groups spoke about the honor of the uniform and the importance of recognizing service. Even ordinary citizens reflected on how easy it was to judge someone without knowing their story. In the following weeks, the officer who had made the arrest faced consequences, But the general never once asked for harsh punishment. Instead, he emphasized education and change. If this mistake leads to better understanding and more respect for others, then something good will come from it, he said in a televised interview. For the general, the incident was not about revenge, it was about reflection. He understood that one person's poor judgment could not erase the countless moments of honor, respect, and gratitude he had received throughout his career. His focus remained on the future, on guiding younger soldiers, on protecting his nation, and on reminding everyone that dignity is a choice. Even in the most difficult situations, the story continued to echo for months. Training programs were introduced in police departments across the state, using the incident as a lesson in humility and awareness. The videos of the general's calm composure were played again and again, inspiring others to stay patient in the face of injustice. In one memorable moment, a group of young recruits at a military academy asked the general how he managed to stay so calm when he was humiliated. He smiled softly and said, "Calmness is not weakness. It is control. On the battlefield, if you lose control, you lose lives. In life, if you lose control, you lose dignity. I chose to keep my dignity because that is something no one can take from me." The recruits nodded, inspired by his words. For them, it was a reminder that strength was not just about power, it was about character. Even outside the military, the story left an impact. Community leaders spoke about the importance of respecting people regardless of race, position, or appearance. Families used the story to teach children about patience and self-control. And many people, even those who had never met the general, felt proud that someone in such a high position had shown such humility and discipline. The general's life returned to its steady rhythm of service. But the incident followed him like a shadow, yet not a dark one. Instead, it became a light, a reminder of the values he had always stood for. Every salute he received after that seemed deeper, more meaningful. Every handshake carried silent respect. One evening, months after the event, the general stood once again at a ceremony. Soldiers lined up before him, their uniforms sharp, their eyes filled with admiration. He addressed them with calm authority. "Respect is not given by force," he told them. "Respect is earned by the way we carry ourselves, especially in moments when others doubt us. You will all face situations where your patience is tested, where people may not see who you truly are. Do not lower yourself to anger. Stand tall. Let your actions, your truth, and your dignity speak louder than any words." The soldiers listened intently. They knew the story. They had seen the videos, heard the news, and many had been personally inspired by how their leader had handled himself. As the ceremony ended, the general looked up at the flag waving in the breeze. He thought back to that night in the small town station, the cold steel of the handcuffs, the mocking words of the officer, and the heavy silence that had followed. And then he thought of the cheering crowd outside, the respectful nods of the federal officials, and the lessons that had spread across the nation. He realized then that the night had not been about humiliation. It had been about revelation. It had revealed not only the flaws in judgment, but also the strength of discipline. It had revealed the power of patience, the reach of truth, and the importance of respect. As he walked away, his steps were steady, his heart strong. He knew that one night in a small town had become more than just an incident. It had become a story about calmness, about truth, and about the quiet power of dignity. And that story would continue to inspire long after the night itself was forgotten.